The Senate is very saddened by his death. Wilson was a beloved figure in the Senate, and by this time he had served almost 20 years in the Senate, as well as his years as vice presidency. He had been a major leader during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and was an extremely respected and highly honored person in the Senate at the time. So the Senate went into mourning. Wilson lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda before he was buried in his hometown up in Massachusetts, and it was a time of great sorrow for the Senate, and particularly because it came in the wake of so many tragedies. The Lincoln assassination in 1865, the war years, the difficulties of Reconstruction, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. All of these had been very traumatic events in not only the political scene, but on the national stage. And so then to have a vice president die in office and to die in the Capitol building while on duty was just sort of the final tragedy of such a long era of tragedy. And that, so it was kind of an extended mourning process. And in those days, when a vice president died in office, there was no way to fill the vacancy. So the vice presidency remained vacant then until the next election, when a new vice president could be elected. So the fact that Wilson is gone in 1875 and over the next 2 years, there's that sort of constant reminder of what the Senate had lost when this beloved figure died.
That's U.S. Senate historian Betty Coed speaking on the national reaction to the death of Henry Wilson. In today's final episode of the series, we'll talk about the end of Reconstruction and the legacy of Henry Wilson. For the final time, this is Henry Wilson and the Civil War. Following Wilson's death in November, the nation was captured by the impending election of 1876. With Grant announcing he would not seek a third term, and the Republican Party missing most of its successful leaders, the deeply unorganized party was thrust into a chaotic convention. Held in Cincinnati, the convention commenced on June 14th. Former Speaker of the House and Maine Senator James G. Blaine was expected to fend off the many Republican candidates to secure a nomination. As the first ballot was tallied, Blaine took the lead, though was short of the required majority. Benjamin Bristow, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Oliver Morton, the former governor of Indiana, came in second and third place. Each man had their flaws, and factions of the different campaigns refused to support the other. After 6 ballots of gridlock, delegates agreed to throw their support behind popular Ohio Governor Rutherford Hayes, who had placed 5th in the first ballot. On the 7th ballot, Hayes narrowly secured the needed majority. Rutherford Hayes was an Ohio-born Republican who had served as a major general during the war. Hayes had been a staunch abolitionist throughout his life and was elected to the House of Representatives in 1865. Hayes was elected as the governor of Ohio in 1875. In a less frenzied convention, the Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. Democrats had become laser-focused on ending Reconstruction in the South. The war had been over for more than 10 years, and those in the South had become increasingly agitated by the constant presence of the military enforcing civil rights. Just as Wilson had warned in 1875, the Republicans had become too unorganized and divided to run an effective and popular campaign. As Election Day approached, the Republicans seemed doomed. When the results came in, no clear winner emerged. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina all had disputed results. White supremacists who had sought to suppress the black vote targeted black communities and voters, threatening and participating in brutal violence. Both campaigns rushed to the states in an attempt to sway the electoral boards to their side. These boards were led by Republicans and had the power to declare what ballots were fraudulent and should be thrown out. All three electoral boards ruled Hayes to be the winner. Despite the electoral board decisions, who would be represented in the Electoral College was unclear. Hayes's electoral count stood at 365, while Tilden's was 384. There were 20 Hayes delegates that were being disputed, 19 from the 3 contested southern states, and 1 from Oregon, where a Hayes elector was currently serving as an appointed or elected public official, a violation of the Constitution. If these 20 electors were permitted to participate, Hayes would secure the required 385 majority. With the Electoral College in gridlock, the election had no winner. As outlined in the Constitution, when electoral votes are in dispute, the President of the Senate must determine the results. As Vice President, Wilson was the President of the Senate, though, following his death, this responsibility fell on Republican Thomas W. Ferry. Democrats refused to accept Ferry's power and argued it should be the responsibility of the entire Congress to decide the outcome. Democrats and Republicans reached a compromise, establishing a committee of 15 to decide the results of the election. 5 Republican and 5 Democrat congressmen, along with 5 members of the Supreme Court, would make up the commission. Their first decision in an 8-7 vote was to award the 19 delegates from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana to Hayes, tying the electoral count 384 to 384. The last delegate from Oregon remained contested. Democrats threatening to filibuster and delay the certification of results, prompting the possibility of a constitutional crisis as Grant's term expired and no preceding president was chosen. Democrats recognized their gridlock strategy might backfire with the public, but they used their threats as tokens for negotiation. Democrats wanted the complete removal of troops from the South and the restoration of their power in state governments. It's unclear what informal agreements the pro-civil rights Hayes campaign may have accepted, but on March 2, 1877, one day before the inauguration, Congress certified Hayes as the winner, with just one electoral vote over Tilden. In his first few months in office, Hayes removed the remaining troops in the South, officially ending the era of Reconstruction and restoring the power of white supremacist rule. Here again is Professor Joan Waugh.
Part of why I think the Reconstruction is described as an unfinished revolution. But it's problematical to me because it depends on how you look at the reason most Americans went to war, and I'm referring to the United States, the people who supported the Union, the vast majority of the population, in other words. Why did what did the loyal citizenry want out of the war? What they really wanted out of the war was the security of the United States going forward. And they wanted, I think, and supported for a while what would be considered radical changes in the racial status in the South. But by the end of Reconstruction, they just wanted to know that the South accepted defeat and were not actively, I don't know how to describe this. We're not actively killing great numbers of Blacks, and other than that, they just simply were exhausted. And it's not fair, it's not right, it's outrageous, but that's what it was.
With free range to shape their policy, Southern states implemented laws to systemically disenfranchise black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. The South rebirthed their society of segregation, suppression, and racial violence, ushering in one of the darkest periods of American history. Black citizens were lynched and terrorized as groups like the KKK flourished and Jim Crow laws dominated. Much of the racial violence and oppression would not begin to subside until the 1960s, over 100 years after the end of the Civil War. As I mentioned in episode 19, Wilson and Harriet had become the adoptive parents of a little girl named Eva. Eva had been given to Wilson's sister-in-law, Nancy, by a woman named Emma Vreeland. Vreeland had claimed to be Eva's mother, desperate to bring her little girl to fortune. Vreeland wrote to Wilson in 1873, explaining her daughter's life story and expressing her deep appreciation for the Wilsons. Vreeland's letter read, quote, "The child whom you and your wife jointly adopted was the daughter of myself and my husband, George Vreeland, of Greenville, New Jersey. She was born in lawful wedlock, I being married to him in June 1865, and the child was born to us on the 1st day of May 1866, and whoever says otherwise is a liar. Nor have I ever spoken to you but in terms of the deepest respect. Any reports to the contrary are wicked slanders, and any letters purporting to be mine and speaking other ways, in the highest terms of gratitude and respect, are forgeries, and I challenge the holders of them to the proof by submitting them to be tested by a specialist in writing. And I now repeat most solemnly that I have never known you in any other manner than as an honorable, high-toned Christian gentleman who sought to aid and save from destruction a much wronged and deeply suffering woman, for which I thank you every day and hour of my life." End quote. The bizarre story of Eva Wilson took another turn when Caroline Vreeland admitted Eva was not, in fact, her daughter. Vreeland wrote to Wilson in 1875, quote, "I feel constrained by my conscience and a deep sense of justice to make you this confession. The little girl which I gave to you and Mrs. Wilson in November 1869 was not, as I then stated, my child. She was obtained in Boston on the evening of May 1st, 1866, through the assistance of Dr. Hobbs and my sister, Annie Taylor, and was taken to the house of my sister in Chelsea, Mass. I do not know who her father or mother are, only that her mother died in giving birth. I pray you to forgive me for my deception in the matter, for I was sorely tempted by my husband's desertion of me, leaving me sick and penniless by evil counsel. I trust you will not allow my fault to prejudice you against the innocent child." End quote. It seems Vreeland claimed Eva was her daughter to form some argument in her divorce case against her husband. The story of Eva Wilson is bizarre and still not completely uncovered. Wilson assigned his nephew, William Coolidge, as the executor of his will, and instructed Coolidge to give money to Eva following his passing. Wilson died before these instructions could be officially incorporated into his will. Coolidge had planned on visiting Wilson days before his passing, but his trip was called off once Wilson began to recover. Coolidge served as the trustee of Wilson's estate, doling money to Eva as needed. When Eva turned 21 in 1889, she claimed she was deserving of the entirety of the estate. Coolidge refused, and the dispute went to court, prompting tabloids to detail the trial with the famed American's will. The Massachusetts court ruled in favor of Eva, and she received whatever was left of Wilson's estate, around $10,000, acquired from the sale of his home after his death. In 1885, Massachusetts Senator George M. Hoar proposed the Senate honor Wilson with a plaque and statue in the Vice President's office. The other Massachusetts Senator, Henry Dawes, said of Wilson, quote, "The public services and the life of Mr. Wilson were entirely American and furnish a remarkable illustration of the working of our institutions." That fame he largely achieved in this body, of which he was the president when he died. The child of poverty, it has been said of him that he had no other home but this Capitol. End quote. Massachusetts sculptor Daniel Chester French was commissioned to sculpt the marble bust, which he finished in the summer of 1886. The bust portrays an incredible likeness to Wilson. The U.S. Senate describes it as being, quote, "marked by simplicity in the subtle, unemphatic modeling, and especially in the striking symmetry of the costume. The broad verticals of coat lapels, vest, and shirt front have a measured, dignified rhythm, and at the same time form a strong base for the head, which is cupped in the incessively carved wing collar. The eyes are left blank. It may be that French intended this as an allusion to classical sculpture and to what he viewed as Wilson's modern-day association with Greco-Roman virtues." End quote. This is U.S. Senate historian Betty Coed.
About 10 years after Wilson's death, the Senate commissioned a marble portrait bust of him, which stands in the Vice President's office to this day. And that was the beginning of a major art collection we have in the Capitol building, which becomes the Vice Presidential Bust Collection. And so we have a marble portrait bust of every vice president who has ever served in and around the Capitol building. And that began with the Wilson bust.
One of my favorite anecdotes I uncovered in my research of Wilson's legacy was the story of his connection to the Watergate scandal nearly a century after his death. In 1898, Vice President Garrett Augustus Hobart sought to redecorate the Vice President's office. Hobart acquired an ornate and sprawling mahogany desk and named it the Wilson Desk in honor of the Vice President whose bust now stood beside it. In the 1950s, when Richard Nixon became the Vice President, he took a liking to the desk, believing it to be named after Woodrow Wilson, one of his political role models. When Nixon was elected as president in 1968, he requested that the Wilson Desk be brought to the Oval Office. Lyndon Johnson had also admired the desk when he was vice president and moved it to Texas when he became president, using it in his home office. The Johnsons had actually purchased the desk during his presidency and then loaned it to Nixon in 1969 for its use in the Oval Office. In his iconic silent majority speech in 1969, Nixon remarked, quote, "50 years ago, in this room and at this very desk, President Woodrow Wilson spoke words which caught the imagination of a war-weary world." End quote. Of course, this was incorrect. Nixon advisors informed him that the desk was not Woodrow Wilson's, but actually Henry Wilson's, although this is also incorrect, as the desk was purchased in 1898, 22 years after Wilson's death. The Wilson desk was implicated in the infamous Watergate scandal when, at the start of his presidency, Richard Nixon inserted a microphone system into the desk that began recording whenever sound was detected, a feature that would cost Nixon the presidency. When Nixon was accused of having been involved in a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel, Oval Office tapes recorded within the Wilson desk exposed the president's lies. When Nixon resigned in 1974, his successor, Gerald Ford, kept the Wilson desk in the Oval Office. A memo to Ford discussing his options in redesigning the office read, quote, President Grant's vice president, Henry Wilson, fell ill and died on the couch next to the desk in 1875. From its use by Vice President Wilson, it took the name the Wilson desk." End quote. This is again untrue. Ford responded to the memo, quote, "Let's keep what we have presently." End quote. Jimmy Carter writes in one of his memoirs, quote, "On the first day, I sat down at the president's desk and looked it over. It was a surprise to see that it was not the same which had been photographed when John Kennedy was there, with his little son peeping out from the door underneath. My first decision, to replace the desk with the one I remembered." End quote. After Carter's objection, the Wilson desk was moved back to the Vice President's office in the Capitol, where it sits today. The room is mostly used ceremonially, although with a 50-50 Senate, Vice President Kamala Harris likely frequents the office. Henry Wilson is most known for his formation of the Free Soil Party, his service as the chair of the Military Affairs Committee during the Civil War, his D.C. Emancipation Act, and the Conscription Act of 1862. He's remembered for his lifelong advocacy of civil rights, equal rights, and for women's suffrage. Wilson was an incredible campaigner who likely spoke to millions during his career and pioneered modern political straw poll methods that have become so casual in our modern world. While Wilson was not a perfect man, he dedicated his life to destroying a hateful system that suppressed his fellow man.
The most important thing in the Capitol that honors Wilson is his marble portrait bust, which still stands in the Vice President's office today. However, I would say there's a less tangible legacy of Wilson, and that's felt in the Capitol, but in Washington, D.C. in general, I think. Every year in Washington, D.C., and throughout the country for that matter, we celebrate Emancipation Day for the freeing of the slaves in the District of Columbia. That's an extremely important day in Washington, D.C. history. And that day is all about Henry Wilson. It was Henry Wilson that proposed and pushed that bill through and got emancipation for enslaved women and men in D.C. in 1862. Every time we talk about the 14th Amendment, we have to think of Henry Wilson because he played an integral role in getting that amendment passed. But also, I think in terms of just the role of civil rights in our society, both how it developed in the post-Civil War years, but the fact that we're still debating issues of civil rights today takes us back to Henry Wilson's legacy. Here you had a person who was essentially born into poverty in New Hampshire, moved to Massachusetts, became a businessman and active in the abolitionist cause, and comes into national politics. It's a real rags to riches story, but he becomes a major figure in Civil War and Reconstruction era and rises all the way to the vice presidency. That is a true American tale. It's a true American success story. And his legacy is wrapped up in all of these issues. And so as we talk about any of these issues that deal with particularly the post-Civil War fight for civil rights for African Americans, Henry Wilson's legacy is always going to be a part of that story.
I hope you help to change this, but I'm always astonished that this generation in the 21st century know nothing about Henry Wilson. You get crickets when you talk about Henry Wilson, and yet he's just one of the most, given our standards today, he lives up to those standards. and so anyway, I just think that his whole his whole background echoes that of so many Americans at the time, including someone like Abraham Lincoln, where he's born dirt poor in New Hampshire from a working class family. Henry Wilson worked as a laborer, as a child laborer, as so many did, And I think he worked as in the shoemaking industry in New Hampshire, and then he became a shoemaking manufacturer when he moved to Massachusetts, and he became really successful. But he never forgot where he came from, and he never forgot the importance of labor and the rights that accrue from a decent labor, making a decent living and working under decent working conditions. And I think that's pretty amazing.
Wilson lived a life of honor and principle and changed the history of his nation for the better. Researching, writing, and producing this podcast has been an incredibly rewarding and challenging journey. I started research 2 years ago and have spent so many hours and days putting each episode together. While I'm upset the series is concluding, I've had so much fun making it and sharing it with you. Stay subscribed to the channel, as additional interviews and bonus episodes will be posted within the series. The Henry Wilson newsletter will continue to be sent out, and I encourage you to sign up if you'd like to stay updated on other projects and pieces on Wilson. You can sign up on the homepage of HenryWilsonHistory.com. This podcast will always be available for free and without ads, and you can find more resources for learning about Henry Wilson and the Civil War on HenryWilsonHistory.com. One of my favorite parts of this series was hearing from listeners, so please reach out if you have any lingering questions or thoughts at HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com. Thank you, as always, to all of the incredible professors, researchers, and historians who I had the privilege of interviewing throughout the series. Those conversations were one of the many highlights of putting Henry Wilson and the Civil War together. In the order of their appearance, thank you to Joe Weiss, John L. Myers, Kyle Leach, Sam Haynes, Jeffrey Boutwell, Betty Coed, Nicole Etchison, John Eric Gillot and Kevin Pollack, Daniel Kevles, Michelle Crowell, Robert Levine, Joan Waugh, and TJ Fallon. I want to especially thank a few people in no particular order. First, Joe Weiss, who supported my idea to make a podcast early on and whose advice and counsel was of great encouragement. Thank you to Nikki Lefebvre of the Natick Historical Society for all of her time and energy in helping me promote the show and for providing me with support and a space to do research. I encourage you to check out all of their resources online at natickhistoricalsociety.org. I'm grateful for my many correspondence over phone and by email with John L. Myers, and for his nearly 4 decades of research that provided me with a firm basis to learn about Henry Wilson. John was always quick to respond to my many questions. I'm also so grateful for all of the friendly people at the countless institutions that provided me with access to papers and research materials, including but not limited to the Natick Historical Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Rutherford Hayes Presidential Library, and the Library of Congress. I would not have been able to access the many primary documents I cited had it not been for the institutions that preserve and share our nation's history. I'm grateful for all of my correspondence with their research assistants in finding unique letters, articles, and images. I want to also thank all of the researchers and experts I corresponded with who are not featured in the podcast. Finally, thank you for taking the time to explore the life of Henry Wilson and learn about the Civil War. I hope you've gained some value from the series and will continue to learn and explore this period. I encourage you to stay active in learning about Henry Wilson and the Civil War and the era of Reconstruction. The weekly Henry Wilson newsletter will continue to be active on a less regular basis, but I still encourage you to subscribe. You can always find me and other projects I'm working on HenryWilsonHistory.com. You can follow me on Twitter at linkmass, LINCMASS, or follow the Henry Wilson Facebook page at Henry Wilson History. I hope you enjoyed the series, and thank you for journeying into the incredible life of Henry Wilson and the Civil War.